passion is it's our loves, our desires, the ones that we might be born with, ones we might cultivate because we live in a certain time and place, and our desires and passions are shaped. And we might pursue our passions in various ways in our life, but pursuing our passion does not necessarily mean, or if we have a passion, that does not necessarily mean it's going to translate into a calling, or translate into a job, or translate into a career, or translate into money.
I'm so glad you're joining me for this hour, because there is an exciting conversation that I am so ready to have. And it is on this new book, You Have a Calling, Finding Your Vocation in the True, the Good, and the Beautiful, by Karen Swallow Prior. I say new. I believe it was released in August. It had been on my pre-order list for months at that point. But Karen, it's so great to have you on Point of View to talk about this with us. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's so good to be with you, Liberty. Thank you.
So this is relevant really for anybody, but I have in mind particularly somebody who is passionate about serving the Lord. They want to know what their calling is. They want to walk in that, but they maybe aren't even exactly sure what that means and how to find that. So Karen, you've written so many wonderful books on literature, on virtue, recently The Evangelical Imagination, which was excellent. And so I wonder if you could tell us, where did this book on calling come from? Why did you feel that this was the time to release this book into the world?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because there really are a lot of books on calling out there already. I know, because I read a lot of them in my research. It's an eternal question. It's always important, but sometimes the questions and the cultural context changes. So I wrote this book at this time, drawing on 25 years of teaching college-age students. Now, it's not just for that age group, but I drew a lot on my conversations with college-age students and their moment in this time, which affects not only them, but all of us. And in this moment, calling is such a fraught concept, and there are so many myths surrounding it and so many unrealistic expectations that I wanted to address some of those. And in fact, in your opening statement, you already mentioned one of them, and that is the role that passion has in our calling.
Yes, and I want to talk about that. I think what we'll do, or what I hope we can do in this conversation, is address some of those myths or even lies that we believe about how we discern our place in this world. Reading the book was eye-opening for me, just realizing, as a millennial, somebody who was raised in the era of, reach for the stars, maybe you'll hit the moon, and do whatever you want to do, and you can do it. Philippians 4:13 taken out of context maybe one too many times. And so this book resonated with me because it really helped me to reframe the way I think about calling and really the beautiful and loving design that God created each of us with. But first, let's deal with work. You begin the book with talking about work, and there are a lot of misconceptions about work. We talk about work because a lot of people think that their calling is their job. But we don't want our work to feel like work oftentimes, because work has a bad connotation in our culture. So maybe talk about how we misunderstand work. And it's not actually a bad thing, is it?
No, it absolutely is not. I mean, and I love words, and I love the different meanings that words have. And so I mentioned the way we use the word work in a lot of different ways, some of them in negative ways and some of them in positive ways. Even just a mundane thing like having to work a handle a little bit to get it to work properly. There's work again. But when we think about the labor that we have to do, the hard effort we have to put in, whether it's to our jobs or to our housework or any task that we undertake, it is effort, and it can be difficult. But work itself is what we were designed to do. It's not, as Christians, we might have the misconception that it is a result of the fall, because there were, limitations and obstacles put in our way, the way of our work after the fall. But when Adam and Eve were placed in the garden by God, he gave them work to do, and it was glorious. And they were to actually co-labor with him in stewarding creation, naming creation, and cultivating and taking care of the garden. So we were designed to work. It's not always fun. It's not always easy, but it is part of what it means to be human. And our work can be expended and take forms in infinite variety of ways, not just the ways that we get paid for.
Yeah, that's so good. And something that helped me as I was thinking through our perceptions of work as Christians is this imagery that you included of a pre-fall abundance versus a post-fall scarcity. And our fear of that scarcity can confuse us even more. So can you explain that?
Yeah, well, of course, I was drawing for that inspiration on John Milton's Paradise Lost. I'm a former English professor, and you can't really stop me from professing English literature. So John Milton paints a picture of Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall, and paints a picture of the lush vegetation and all of the blooms and blossoms and flowers and fruit that Adam and Eve, that was so abundant that their work consisted of cropping and thinning and propping up. And it's a beautiful image for the kind of work that God intended for us, which is amidst abundance. But we often are, motivated for real reasons, and it can really exist. We're often motivated more by images of scarcity. And of course, I do want to say at the outset that I am writing for a particular cultural context and moment, and that, most of my readers are going to be Americans or in the Western world, and and plagued by questions that come with modernity. Mm-hmm. And one of the curses we have, we are living in an age of abundance, and even abundant choices. That can often be part of our problem in finding our calling, is because we have so many choices. But yet we think I think your generation came up with this FOMO, the fear of missing out. That can be real, but we have to recognize it for what it is, and decide, are we really living in a world of scarcity, or is there much more opportunity and much more openness and possibility than we might see, because we've trained our minds to just zoom in on certain things and to not see other opportunities that are there.
Yeah, and that's so good. And something that hopefully we can get to a little bit more in the conversation is how, when we are making a fear-based decision about missing out, that FOMO, and this, I resonated with this so much, then it actually can distract us from the thing that we are supposed to be doing. And it is okay. Yeah. It's okay to say no, and we live at a time, and I think my generation has been raised where we're afraid to say no, and yet we're also afraid to say yes, because there, like you said, there is so much abundance. And when many young people in particular, I think, are trying to discern what they want to study in college, maybe what line of work to pursue, advice that they often receive is just follow your passion. What are you passionate about? And that sounds like good advice, but Karen, in your book, you actually explain why that can lead us down the wrong path and even set us up for disappointment. So can you talk about that?
Yes. And first, I do want to say that passions are good, and there are times when we should follow them and where that can lead to good things. But a big part of what I'm doing in this book is to kind of separate out some of the words that we might conflate, and a lot of assumptions that we make, again, especially in this particular moment that we've been raising the last couple of generations with. And so passion is it's our loves, our desires, the ones that we might be born with, the ones we might cultivate because we live in a certain time and place, and our desires and passions are shaped. And we might pursue our passions in various ways in our life, but pursuing our passion does not necessarily mean or if we have a passion, that does not necessarily mean it's going to translate into a calling or translate into a job or translate into a career or translate into money. And so if we stop and look at what passion is and what role it can play, and what role it might not play and what assumptions we have about it, I think that's when we can better understand the good role that our passions can have in our life, and then the way that may or may not be connected to our vocation or our calling.
Yeah, that's so good and helpful. Something that has bothered me for a while is that in, I guess, this generation and young people today, our current culture, really, there is a pressure to monetize everything. And so if you have something that you are passionate about, people say, turn it into a side hustle or, sell it, make money. And some things are just meant to be done for the love of the thing. And that's actually healthy for us to have those loves or hobbies maybe. So can you speak to that a little bit about how it's okay for us to just have something that we enjoy? We don't have to, maybe it can be freeing for people to not feel pressured to make a job out of that.
Yeah, again, there's nothing wrong with making money out of your passion if that works for you. But I think because that's become such an assumption, that's where the danger lies, where I've encountered many people, not just young people, but people of older age too, who feel like they're not doing things right, or they've missed the mark, or they're a failure because they haven't monetized their passion. I'm 60 years old, so I grew up before a lot of this, but I bring that perspective. For example, when I was a teenager, I've always loved animals. I've loved all animals all my life. And at one point I thought, well, I love animals. I guess I should be a veterinarian. And I even did a little internship with my veterinarian and worked on a horse farm and so forth. But I realized, fortunately, at some point that I just want to love animals for what they are and enjoy them as pets and not make them my career. And that just seemed that there was no pressure on me. It was just an insight that I had. And now fast forward, a few decades, and I just see so many people assuming that if they have a passion, it needs to be monetized. And if it's not monetized, then they're failures or they have the wrong passions. And again, as you said, and I say in the book, sometimes we just want to enjoy things for what they are with no pressure and not having to make money on them. And that's when we actually get the most enjoyment out of them.
Yeah, so good. And with passions, as you said a few minutes ago, they may not overlap with our calling, or we may not be making money from our passions, and that's okay. But they are important. And one of the reasons that they are important is because of where they can point us. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I do think passions are important. I do look at what passion really means, and it actually, etymologically, its root word means suffering. And that's something important to think about, because sometimes we might have a sort of passing interest in something, or there might be something, I wish I could do this, but we're not willing to do the suffering and make the sacrifice that it takes to do it at all, or to do it well. I can think of many things in my life that I would just love to be able to do without any sacrifice, but I can't, and so therefore I don't. And so we need to think about just how important passion is, and how as human beings we are limited, so we can't invest every part of our lives in multiple passions over the course of our lives without ending up in some sort of unhealthy kind of situation. And so we should think about, what if it's really a passion, then we're going to sacrifice for it. That's what the nature of passion is. But sometimes we just have curiosity or interest, and we explore it and pursue it, and it doesn't lead anywhere. And as I say in the book, there also, especially with your generation and following, I found a lot of pressure put on young people to have a passion, to be passionate. And if someone hadn't discovered a passion or just didn't have a passion, sometimes those people feel like there's something wrong with them. And the fact is that we're all different. Some people are made to be very passionate and they need to learn to rein it in. And yet other people, I think of my husband, I think of my best friend, they're just very even-keeled people. And so they don't necessarily come across as having these driving passions. They're just steady and even. And the world needs all of us, all kinds of people. And again, so much of what I'm talking about in this book is pressure or assumptions about formulas or sayings or ideas that aren't, they can be true, but not necessarily, and maybe not even often. And I think the role passion has in our callings and our work and our financial situation is something that's gotten really distorted in recent decades.
Yeah. Yeah, that is helpful to think about it in that way. And it does relieve a lot of pressure for young people, I think. And this leads us to calling, though, and obviously that's in the title of your book. But there is a fundamental difference, and we can discuss this more when we come back from the break. But in just the last couple of minutes, there's a fundamental difference between calling and passion, particularly where it originates. And you had a little horror movie reference I thought was funny in this part. But what's that fundamental difference between passion and calling?
Well, this is really the main thesis of my book, and I can say it succinctly and expand after the break. But passion comes from inside, and calling comes from outside of ourselves. Just like when it's that horror movie, when a stranger calls, the main character, the babysitter, learns that the call is coming from inside the house, and that's a horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
Real callings come from outside.
Yeah, and that is so helpful. That I loved it when I read that, because we, kind of following up from the passion section and discussion, we are often told to look inside for direction, and we don't even realize it. But I love your book because it helps to reorient us as Christians and realize that, well, we don't look inward for answers. We look to the Lord. We look to God. That we're not supposed to be looking inside ourselves necessarily. So something that, as you mentioned, might be a passing interest, or even something that we really, really care about, that's not necessarily the guiding post that we think it is. And there is just so much good information and research about passion and about calling and about how our brains work that is just so fascinating. So again, I encourage people to go to pointofview.net and click on the link. You have a calling for yourself, and read it. If you're watching, I'm actually holding it up right now. It's not that long of a book. It's a very easy, simple read. It's the perfect gift for a young adult or a graduate, or just anybody who is thinking, how can I discern what I'm supposed to do with my life and how I follow the Lord. And the thing is, though, and I think this is what makes it so powerful, it's not a step-by-step, do this, follow this checklist, and now you know what your calling is. And that's kind of what we're dispelling here in this book, what Karen is dispelling. But it is reframing the way we think, giving us a deeper understanding about what these things mean. What does vocation mean? What does calling mean? What is passion? And how does that connect to all of it? What is work? And who are we as human beings? And it gives us a focus through which we can look and better discern the things that God is calling us to. So before the break, Karen, you established that calling comes from outside of us. Passion is something that comes from inside. So if you don't mind, go ahead and expound on that a little bit more for us.
Yeah. And of course, we would love it for those two things to always and completely overlap. And sometimes they do. But again, understanding the distinction is helpful. The shortest definition that I cite in the book for calling, which I really like, is a transcendent summons that originates beyond the self. And we most often think of calling as, in our work life, as part of being in the modern age in America. Everything centers around work, which is, not necessarily good, but that's where we are. But calling can be so much more than work. And I also want to say there are ways that it definitely may not overlap with our passions, because callings include, for example, the roles that we have in families and relationships, or the role we have as a neighbor or citizen. And when I think about my own life, I'm in a stage of life where I just walked through a year of illness, the illness and death of my mother. And I was called to be there with her and for her. That's not something I'm passionate about. That's not something that I wanted to happen, but I could not answer that call. And now with my elderly father as a widower, I'm called to help and support and be there for him in this stage of his life. That is a transcendent summons that I did not choose. I didn't go looking for it. It's not something that I love to do, but I would never not do it for anything. So that's an example of calling that goes beyond just our job and our work and our passions, but shows how it originates from outside ourselves, and it's something that, whether we like it or not, or chose it or not, it's something that we really have to do. And of course, sometimes that is the work that we do. As I said already, I was made to, it said in the book, I was made to teach, and I didn't discover that until a little later than in my life after college. But once I did, I knew that was my calling, and I do love it. I am passionate about it. And so that's an example of how my calling and my passion do overlap. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to think in terms of seasons too. And that's something you talk about, and like you just gave the example of, that our calling may look different in different seasons or different settings, and we may be called to particular work in a particular season. And so with the example of family and caring for those relationships and caring for those who are close to us, that is an example of a calling that comes from, a familial relationship, or looking at our community. And as Christians, we are called to care for those that the Lord puts in our lives. But another clue that you mention is looking at our talents. And so this can often, again, you do such a good job of really delineating between all of these terms and defining what they mean, because they can get confused thinking like we need to be talented at what we're passionate about and passionate about our talents. And sometimes they mix, sometimes they don't. But when you look at something that you are skilled at or gifted at, that can often point us to a calling, can't it?
Absolutely. Because again, sometimes those gifts and talents, or most of the time, those are not even things that we necessarily choose. Those are part of our contingencies. They're part of the way that God made us, or the way He placed us. If we're born in a certain time and place, then we have opportunities to develop gifts and talents that perhaps people 300 years ago didn't have. I was born a very short person, so I would never develop the gift and talent of being a basketball star. And so I had to find other ways to, not that I wanted to, but, just an example. But we are given not only gifts and talents, but also opportunities, or not, to cultivate them. And so that's a really good clue. And on the flip side, one of the things that I talk about in terms of gifts and talents is that there are many callings and roles for which we really should have those gifts and talents, and not just the passion. I'm sure many of us, anyone can relate to this, that we've encountered people who want to be a rock star, or want to be a dancer, or want to be an artist or singer, and they don't have the talent to do it well. And they perhaps should not be serving others in that capacity. Other things are much more dangerous, like everyone's had a bad teacher, and perhaps that person should have found something else, or a bad spiritual leader or pastor who's not gifted in that way. So this can actually be dangerous and serious if we pursue something that we're not gifted to do. Not only are we possibly doing harm and cheating others and ourselves, but we're also probably not finding the thing that we really are equipped to do and are talented enough to do. And so it works two ways. So I really do think gifts and talents are guides for us. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll always get a chance to use them, or always be in a position or place where they get to be used to our best ability. It's a guide, but not a guarantee.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. A guide, but not a guarantee. And it does take humility and trust in the Lord and in his plan. And so this is something that I wrestle with, but you quote Gordon Smith, who says, "The need does not determine the call." And I think a lot of well-meaning Christians who have a heart for service feel compelled to meet all the needs, to do all the things. What's tough is that that actually doesn't always serve others well, because maybe we're stepping into something that we're not really good at, and we might actually cause harm, as much as that's not our intention, or somebody else is called to that role. And so, as we mentioned earlier, it can be really hard to say no, but it really is part of being in the body of Christ to know that you have to say no sometimes, because that's the right thing to do, and you're not responsible for meeting all the needs. That was convicting for me personally.
No, absolutely. And this is sort of a blind spot for Christians, because, we are taught and we are supposed to serve, but we still have to be good stewards of our own time and talents, good stewards of what God has called us to do and what he's not called us to do. And as you said, I like how you put it, like we could be denying someone else the opportunity to step up and use their gifts and time and talents to do something that we're doing instead, just because we couldn't say no. And then, a little bit darker side of the same issue is that, unfortunately, and it doesn't even have to be intentional, but, Christian ministries and churches are filled with need, often underfunded, and that's partly, for big reasons, the way our society is structured and the way our institutions are structured and our priorities. But it can move into even exploitation, when institutions rely over and over and too heavily on free labor or volunteers or underpaid staff. And again, we should give, and we should give sacrificially, whether of our time or money. But at some point, if it becomes exploitative or just simply unsustainable and unhealthy, then that's not stewarding our callings well either.
Yeah, and that's so wise. And it brings me back to something that dovetails nicely with those who are listening in the first hour, just the importance of prayer and communing with the Lord and seeking wisdom from outside of ourselves in him and in his word, so that we can have that discernment, because there are so many good things in the world that we want to say yes to, so many opportunities, and oftentimes coming from a place of good intentions. And yet, like you said, there is exploitation. Unfortunately, there is manipulation, and sometimes there's just pride. And we want to be called to something, as you write, that we're not actually called to. And so being willing to humble ourselves and seek the Lord in prayer is such an important aspect of this. But we're about to go to one more break, and then we'll come back for a few more minutes and move on to discussing the transcendentals, which is not something we talk about very much in modern culture. That's not a word you're seeing thrown around on Facebook or X very much. But what are those? What does it mean to be looking towards the true, the good, and the beautiful? But Karen, let's talk about the transcendentals a little bit. First of all, what does that mean?
I love that you said before the break that you don't see that term thrown around on social media much, and you don't. And I love to talk about them, so thank you. So the transcendentals it comes from classical philosophy, but dovetails very well with Christian teaching. And they're basically properties of being that are, again, outside of ourselves, that are absolute and eternal ways of being. And the classical ones are truth, goodness, and beauty. And the reason that they're called transcendental in the way I just described is because there is nothing that exists that we would not all understand and desire to be true, good, and beautiful in what it is and what it was made for. Whether we're talking about a chair or a tree or a person. We're all made with a purpose for existence, and and everything that exists, we would want to be the truest, best, and most beautiful form that it could be. We'll all fall short, but we know that these standards exist, and that's what we're striving for. And ultimately, they end in God because He is the ultimate source of all that is true, good, and beautiful. So when we strive for these things, we're actually striving for God Himself.
That is so beautifully said. And another thing you say in the book is that it's to pursue the truth, beauty, and goodness is to embrace the reality of what it means to be human. And that's because we're made in God's image, right?
Right, right. And, to connect it to calling, because it really does seem like maybe a big jump from calling and vocation to the transcendentals. But, the definition that I gave earlier in the show of calling is a transcendent summons that originates outside of ourselves. So a calling, a vocation comes from outside of ourselves in the same way that these eternal absolute qualities do. And so if we're pursuing those, my argument is we actually are not only going to find our calling, but we're actually fulfilling our calling because we're all made, as you said, because we're made in God's image, we're all made to pursue those things.
Yeah, and this is something that I think is so needed in our time, but maybe people think, okay, well, that sounds nice for a philosophy class or, a sermon or something. But what about today? I mean, you've got problems, you've got politics, you've got division. There's urgency. If you don't have an opinion on this thing right now, then you're on the other side. And, maybe somebody is thinking or wrestling with, is this kind of a luxury that we don't have time for at this moment when so much is at stake in our culture?
Well, what I try to do in the book is really make these abstract, philosophical, theological terms practical and to break them down, because I believe that not only should we do these things, but that we actually can pursue these transcendentals in much more everyday, ordinary ways than we tend to think. So, for example, in talking about truth, of course, we believe in, capital T truth, absolute truth, moral truth, all these things Christians talk about a lot. But the way I connect truth to calling is that we have to see the truth about the work itself, the reality of the world that we live in, and the truth about ourselves as well. Just as we talked about earlier, do I actually have the talent and ability to do this thing well so that it serves other people well? Or is this just, an idea I'm infatuated with and would like to do? If we don't see the truth about ourselves and the truth about the need and the world we live in, then we're not going to be able to find our vocation. So we have to be real. We have to know ourselves. We have to know who we're made to be, and we have to know about the work or the role that we're trying to fill. So that's a very concrete way of thinking about this transcendental truth that can apply not just to long-term decisions, but even the decisions we have to make every day about in face of the limitations of our time and ourselves and what the day has in store for us. We have to be truthful.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, how could our world not be better served if more of us were focusing on the true and the good and the beautiful? And I love how you do make it so practical. And there's so much we could talk about, but time flies when you're having fun. And so we're almost at the end of the hour. But just any final words or things that are on your heart that you'd like to share with regard to what you've poured into this book and what you hope people glean from it?
Well, I closed on a chapter of the beautiful because that's my favorite. And I really hope that I lead people to this, again, very philosophical, abstract notion and help them see how practical it is, because I believe that there is so much beauty in our everyday, ordinary lives and in the way that we can go about our ordinary tasks in a way that offers the proportion and integrity and illumination that are qualities of beauty. If we think about how we can do that in everything we do every day, then we are fulfilling a beautiful calling, no matter what we're doing, because we're called to different things. And if we fulfill it beautifully, then I think that we are honoring our Lord and Savior, serving our neighbor well, and we will find significance and meaning in what we're doing.
Amen. Well, Karen, thank you so much for being on Point of View today. I love all of your books. It's been a joy to talk with you. And just thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So if you would like to learn more about Karen's books, get a copy of her latest, You Have a Calling, you can find her links at pointofview.net. Thank you so much for listening to Point of View Highlights. I'm Liberty McCarter. Thanks so much for listening to today's Point of View Highlights. I'm Liberty McCarter, host of the Know Why podcast, a weekly podcast for young adults who want to know why they believe what they believe. If you have young adults in your life who would like more meaningful conversations like this, send them over to knowwhypodcast.com. And we'll see you next time on Point of View Highlights.